So we were looking at the experimental design, and here what a researcher would do, they would have a control group and an experimental group. This type of research you would have, you find mostly, let's say, in medical tests. For example, I'm sure this kind of research was done a lot when people were coming up with the COVID-19 vaccine. But we can also find it in ICT, or specifically IS research. If one is testing a particular solution, on, let's say, usability, on functionality, on robustness, or anything like that, an experimental design can work. I think one of the articles we looked at, specifically on the context-aware application, was looking at the experimental design. The other is survey. So this the survey type of research is very much a quantitative research method. So this is where you are looking at quantifiable data from a certain number of people. So here you know that you are looking for certain variables within a certain context, and you want to correlate these variables or find causalities between them. So a survey, first of all, we understand must be done with a huge number of people. And this number of people would have been sampled from an even bigger number of people. So let us say you're doing research maybe on university students. You would need to know how many university students are there in Uganda. If you're doing research on either private university students or public university students, or all university students as a whole, you'd find out what's the total number of all university students, and then you'd say what sample size can represent them. You'd want to know how many university students are in public universities and how many are in private, and then you'd say, if I picked this number from private and this number from public, then they are representative of all of them. Then you would want to know what is it exactly I'm looking for. Am I looking for certain characteristics in both male and female students? Am I looking for students who belong to a certain category, maybe those who are in science subjects, those who are in arts, things like that. So a survey is basically looking at data that can be quantified, or qualitative data. This is what a survey would be looking at. But it can also, what I remember, what Crippen, I think it was Crippen, was it Crippen or Tom, who was asking about demographic data. That is also a kind of survey data, which is going to be collected over a certain period of time. That is also typically is the survey method. But you decide if am I doing a longitudinal, am I doing cross-sectional survey. So it can be applied in different areas. So surveys are normally used in a deductive approach. Yeah, so if you're doing something quantifiable, that's where a survey comes in. It is an economical method for collecting data. I remember when we were during the lockdown, with my work, which I do with PICAO, PICAO wanted to collect some data from all health facilities that carry out palliative care. And simply they had designed their questionnaire. They gave it to me. I input it, I translated it into a Google form, and then they sent it out to all these health workers. And these health workers submitted their responses, and we got these responses, downloaded them, and just began to analyze them using Excel. So that was quite economical. It didn't take much. The only thing one needed was bandwidth to download and an email address, they download, fill out this information and send it back. It's quite different when you're doing, let's say, qualitative research. For example, my research where I stayed with the community for 2 years. Every time they had a workshop, I traveled there, I sat down with them and listened, and it would take days and it was quite laborious. So surveys are usually quite economical and quite easy to do. And it often involves questionnaires, very structured questionnaires. So the research questions that you get, you maybe want to determine behavior, attitudes, beliefs, opinions, character. You're trying to find out the characteristics. Maybe if you're trying to find out characteristics of university students or those things like that. So where would we find what would be appropriate for a survey? If you're trying to determine expectations, classify certain things, classify certain people, certain things, knowledge. So basically things that can be quantified, the things that that we can measure. That's when a survey is quite appropriate. The third is case study. So case study normally is qualitative in nature. And here you may want to understand a phenomena or the dynamics of a certain setting. Now you notice we say we want to use it when we want to explore something in its early stages. So this is usually qualitative in nature or inductive. In nature. With the situation, hold on a second, please. Somebody was calling me and I'm using the phone to pick network. So we would use it when we want to explore something or something is unique in within its particular setting. I've been constantly giving the example of e-learning. Something like e-learning is quite unique in the context in which it is. Why would e-learning work for a public university or for a private university and not for a public university? And not all private universities have gone e-learning. So there are different situations that have happened in each different case. UMU had several dynamics working within the context by the time COVID hit, which dynamics were not happening in other universities. I'll give you an example. UMU had a very interesting project going on called TESIA, which was looking at retraining lecturers in the teaching and learning process, and they were specifically looking at technology. So when COVID hit, this project came in and really did quite a lot of work in changing mindsets. So you may find like another university which had Moodle running, has Zoom running, but still hasn't taken off. But simply because UMU had that extra dynamic that happened. Then other situations, you may find issues of numbers. Some universities, so you find a case study produces a dynamic, a case study research will show you a dynamic that a survey will never pick up. We also saw one of the presentations done by one of the groups, I think it was on, what was it, the research on Finland, which was trying to work on, I think, interoperability or something like that, where they first did research in the US and in other European approach in terms of on how to come up with a framework or a solution for Finland. So that particular multi-case study approach probably helped in policy yeah, on how to make policies or how to come up with certain decisions. So something like that. The fourth is grounded theory. Now, with grounded theory, most likely none of you will ever use this. So this is a research method which is employed when some people or someone wants to come up with, develop a new theory. So this is usually a very theoretical in nature. It's very it's not something that, for most of us who are in ICT or IS, where we do empirical research, that is research that is based on facts. We rarely will use this research method. So you may find this mostly in areas of philosophy or metaphysics. You may find people doing this kind of research where they are developing a new theory, more or less. This is where you may find this kind of research. It's very, very much qualitative in nature. And it's the most qualitative method that you can think of ever possible, where you're starting from scratch, more or less. But for most of us in ICT, research has been done already. So you're building your research based on other people. So we rarely will use grounded theory. Ethnography. Now, ethnography is quite interesting. It is a research method that is heavily grounded in the social science side and development studies side. I remember I used this research method for my particular research, and I remember my supervisor saying that you will not find any of us actually ever having using ethnography. But ethnography is a very interesting research. It's highly inductive, and it was developed in the field of anthropology, people who were studying cultures. Those people who went to study a particular culture. Let us imagine, let us say somebody from Europe trying to understand one of the most primitive cultures, those cultures that are rarely touched by, are not in touch with the rest of the world. When you decide to say, let me go and live with a certain community to understand their interpretation of life, their interpretation of what is happening. So it is really time consuming, but that was the research, one of the research methods I used, because I sat with a community for about 2 years. I not stayed with them, but I really participated with them in many of the activities to understand what they do. Now, you might say in ICT, where can this be used? It's possible, especially if we want to understand the dynamics of a certain organization, why people do things the way they do. In IS in particular, I just want to say, when I'll give the example of Zenode, Zvarsity. Most of you are using Zvarsity. Zvarsity, when it came into UMU, one of the things I encountered it as head ICT. One of the things that I would note as an ICT person is that Zvarsity was created as a generic system. But when you come down to look at organizations have their own cultures and their own way of doing things. You may think an organization would be just a generic thing, that all universities work the same way, but that's not the case. Universities work in different ways. Look at UMU itself. UMU is a Catholic founded university. There are reasons why UMU was set up as UMU. And if you go also to, let's say, a university like UCU, there are reasons why UCU was set up. There are reasons why IU was set up. And there are things that happen within UMU simply because the university is Catholic. I remember there was a gentleman, he's now, I think, in Cavendish. I think he's now the Vice Chancellor of Cavendish. And he was talking about HR activities and issues that happen that are so unique to Umu because Umu is Catholic. I'll give you an example. The 18th of October is a very special day for Umu. Why? And it may not be special for anyone else, but it's very special to Umu on the Umu calendar, that even on that day, classes will not go on. There will be celebrations, there will be a big mass, and so on and so forth. Why? Because that is the day the Uganda Martyrs were canonized. You go to any other institution, 18th October is just any other day. It doesn't mean anything. But for Umu, it means something. Now, something that small, it creates a whole new dynamic. And if you've not taken it into consideration, let's say you are building a system for Umu, your system will fail. So you can imagine something like building an information system for Umu. You can't have a generic system that you bring off the shelf and simply put there. So even the cultures, you find an organization has its own specific culture, its own way of looking at things, and ethnography can actually come in to teach you as an IS student something, or an IS profession, something that you may have missed out. So a key point to note is that it is very time consuming, but it brings out certain things that may not otherwise have been understood. Action research. Now, those of you who may have read that article, you may realize action research actually goes hand in hand with IS. But action research, what it essentially means is that involves practitioners together with a researcher. So what action research does, action research, one, let me first point out, it's quite common amongst the education field, those doing research in education, but also in IS, it is there, as you saw by the article that I gave you. So what does action research do? Action research looks at solving real life problems. So you have a situation where you have a case study and there is an existing problem, and the researcher gets the practitioners or those in the case studies or the stakeholders involved in coming up with the solution. So when the solution is got, it's placed in the context, the researcher stakeholders in determining the effectiveness of the solution. And in that process, or that iterative process, the researcher is collecting information and is bringing it back to refining the solution and reports back. So if you want to look at it closely, look at that the IS article that I attached. It gives an example of action research in ICT or IS. Design science. Now, this one is one of, if you are going to design a solution, whether it is an IS solution, a system, or for example, we find a lot of situations in IS, ICT research where someone says, I want to develop a framework. Design science is the method for you. As long as you're designing an artifact, look at this term artifact, an innovative artifact. And this is where IS research and ICT really comes in, whether it's a framework or it's a model, whatever, or it is a system, an application, you're designing an artifact. Then design science research is a method that you definitely are going to use. So here I have some of the authors who are developers of this method. You can look at them. I can also give you some articles, share with you some articles. Now, exactly how does the design science method look at that? You notice that I may focus on some methods more than others because they are quite popular within our fields of ICT and IS. So here you identify a problem. I think, Tom, you raised something like this. You identify an existing problem, something that motivates you within a certain context. You then define an objective. You then define an objective of a solution. Yeah, I remember, Tom, specifically you raised this issue where you say that there was an existing solution, but it's not filling a certain gap, so that is your problem. Then to fill that gap, you have a solution as an objective. So then you design and develop that solution. You come up with your first prototype. You demonstrate it, or you place it in your context. Then you evaluate. So when you evaluate what you've evaluated, remember, as Tom, I think I pointed out, when you evaluate, that's when you determine, did it fill the gap that you initially pointed out? So your evaluation may communicate a positive or a negative. So that is what you'd be reporting out. Your solution is not necessarily what you're communicating, but the evaluation, your evaluation results. Before I go any further, have you understood? Because this one is a key research method for most of us that we shall use. Do we have any questions so far?
No.
Okay. Now we have action design research. So action design research is a relatively new method. It was developed in 2001. And it's also one method that I also used in my research. So action design research essentially combines action research together with design science, or design science research. So those who proposed action design science, they were basically critiquing design science research. They say that an artifact is normally designed separate from the context, and it comes in as a foreign innovation. And many times they say it may not work because it is foreign. So those who are proposing action design research were basically saying that an artifact should be designed essentially together with the context, where it says you design your innovation together with the stakeholders. So it's basically, if you read through these articles, they explain how you can involve the context in the design process of your artifact, so that eventually when you have a solution at the end, the context was involved in producing your end result. So you can also look at that. It's also an interesting method for those in IS and ICT. Any questions so far? No?
No.
Okay. Okay. Let me just move to the next method. I'm thinking I will hold off the validation and generalization part for another time, because people may be tired, but also give you time to reflect on these others so that I can really give time to validation. So the other methods I want to introduce are those which are time bound, those that we talked about, the longitudinal studies. We have methods which are like cross-sectional studies. You collect data at only one particular point in time. Data that is going to be affected within a particular point in time. What do I mean? In institutions of higher learning, we've been receiving a lot of requests for people who are looking to us as respondents to see the impact of COVID-19 on teaching and learning in institutions of higher learning. that is really a cross-sectional study, because maybe COVID in the next maybe five years will no longer be an issue. So whoever is collecting data needs to know the impact of COVID-19 on institutions of higher learning. This is the time to collect that data. This is the time. If there is research on maybe, like we wanted to find out the demographics of those who are maybe using certain systems in this time, maybe online shopping, this would be the time. That is really a cross-sectional study, a study that is looking at a specific period, at a specific point in time. That is a cross-sectional study. Then we have longitudinal study that collects data at certain points, particular points in time. So if you're looking for something that's going to happen over a 5-year period, 10-year period, that is a longitudinal study. Now, longitudinal studies can be picked, really done by those certain authority, like I pointed out, like Uganda Bureau of Statistics is one very good example of studies that they collect data over long periods of time. Then we have studies which are exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory. This one may require multiple strategies. They may require multiple strategies. So your research, you may do your research, which is going to do an exploratory study. You may be doing a research which is going to be descriptive. Any research, whatever the case, whether it's going to be case study or design science, you may have to choose whether it's going to be the exploratory, whether it's going to be descriptive, or it's going to be explanatory or analytical. It's going to be one of them. You may say, I'm going to do, my research is going to be exploratory, but also give a description. But whatever the case, it's one of them. It has to be one of them. If it is going to be explanatory, then most likely it's going to be highly quantitative in nature. If it's going to be largely qualitative, then it's going to be one of these two, either descriptive or exploratory, one of them. Am I making sense here?
No, not on this one.
Okay. Now, if somebody is now the example, I think it was Tom Crippen who gave the idea of doing a research that is looking at demographics. Tom, yes, looking at demographics, the demographics of users of certain systems or certain platforms. Tom can make a decision that I just want to describe users of certain platforms. I just want to describe them, that they are of a particular age, they are of a particular income earning group, of a certain social strata. Maybe they come from certain social settings. Maybe these are people who are graduates, people who are from these kinds of families, people who normally reside in this particular area. That is more or less descriptive. Now, if somebody says, I want to find out the causality, make it a bit more analytical. It both may be surveys, but I want to make it more or less analytical, where I want to find out the people who use these platforms, why do they use them? Maybe in my survey, I may ask, why did you use this platform? Okay, what the reasons for them using these platforms? And I ask a more detailed questionnaire to find out causality, to explain why is it they use this particular platform, and why is it that you decide to shop online as opposed to going to a physical shop. There I'm making it more analytical in nature. Now in the descriptive, I may, in the descriptive part, I'm just describing the demographics. But in explanatory or analytical, I'm really finding out causality. What causes this? Now, normally in quantitative research, this causality, you actually use even theory for finding out the cause of something. You remember when I gave you the example of using term theory? The term theory can help you find the cause of something. Whereas when I'm doing descriptive, I'm just finding out who is it that is visiting this, using this platform. It is somebody of this particular age group, of this particular education background, who comes from these particular areas of Kampala, maybe Kampala, this type of district, a person who earns this kind of income. That is descriptive. Yeah, that is descriptive in nature. If it is exploratory, I'm finding out, I'm just going to find out, do we even have people using these platforms? We may have them and nobody is using them. Do we actually have people using these platforms? If we have them, who are they? That's an exploratory research. So an exploratory research may be qualitative in nature. Descriptive, this may be quantitative in nature. Explanatory, this may be highly quantitative or highly qualitative. Do I make sense?
Yes, you do.
Okay. So this one, all our other research methods can fall under any of these. All the other research methods can fall under any of these, depending on what it is you want to do as a researcher, what problem it is you want to discover. So now, just to give you an example, for me, my research was in ICT, under exploratory, in an area where it was highly unknown. How are mobile applications going to behave in a rural context in terms of healthcare? That was exploratory.
Oh, okay. So to understand this properly, you use the exploratory in a scenario where you're researching on something new.
Yes. When it's something is relatively new, you can be exploratory. Also descriptive, you know something about it, but you need to know more. You may be like what Tom was saying. We may know people are using certain platforms, but we really want to find out who are they. We want to find out more. Who are they? So all of them, it depends on the goals or purpose of your research. Okay, I'm thinking we may have had a lot. Let us stop here, and then we come back on Thursday and look at the remaining part on validity, validation, and then the ethical elements of our research. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay. Unless we have any questions. Do we have any questions? No? Okay, so then I'll wish you a good night. Dan, if you can share with me afterwards the recording, I'd be grateful so that I can. Okay, okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Let's hope everyone has a good night, and we shall